So I found this wooden base that had a little cutaway for a music box mechanism. I forget what it was originally used for, but I kept it because I felt that I would be able to do something interesting with it. I didn't really care for the song played on the mechanism that came with this base, since it was too cute for my tastes. So I replaced it with one that played a song that better suited the mood that I planned to go for with this diorama. I cut a piece of plywood to use as a surface for the diorama, and then cut a few pieces of balsa that I took from a model airplane kit to add some contours. At this point, I was ready to glue the base onto the diorama. After that, I spread some celluclay over the base for texture, and once that was dry, I added some potting soil. For vegetation, I added some lichens on camera and some static grass off camera to the base with diluted PVA glue. I had started to sculpt the figures while I was working on the base, and since one of the figures was going to be lying down, I tested his placement on the base just to make sure that his posture matched the contours of the ground. The figures were built from wire armatures that I fleshed out with milliput once I was happy with the pose. I made one standing figure and one lying down. To clothe the standing figure, I started with a lump of green stuff and milliput mix and formed it around his leg. After mushing the putty into a basic shape, I refined the folds using dental tools and silicone shapers. Then I did the same thing with the other leg. I had decided that this was to be a cold weather diorama. I always like westerns that take place in a winter setting. It's a nice change of pace from what you usually see. For that reason, I needed this figure to be wearing a scarf. I made the scarf using my usual green stuff and milliput mix. The wide brim on his cowboy hat was made using some green stuff that I rolled out after leaving to sit for about an hour before working with it. After that, I made the rest of his hat and allowed the putty to cure. The last thing to do was to sculpt a scarf that's been wrapped around his head. For a coat, I decided to give this figure what was called a blanket coat, or a capote. To make this, I took some more green stuff in milliput blend and worked it into the right shape. Now normally when I'm making a coat, I would sculpt the body first and leave the arms to last. But since I planned to have the left arm tucked inside, I sculpted the left sleeve before moving on to the next step. I then sculpted the front of the coat. I had originally intended for this figure to be wearing a sash wrapped around his waist, so I made an indentation around his torso to allow for that. I had second thoughts about that idea though, so I filled it in. After all that was done, I added a hood. To make his right arm, I started by wrapping some thin copper wire around the arm, and then added some milliput on top to flesh it out. I bent the ends of the wire around his revolver and used some putty to give it shape. After that, I sculpted the sleeve, and I was ready to move on to the next figure. Because the second figure was going to be lying down, I needed to do my best to make sure that he was sculpted in a way that matched the contours of the ground. As a result, throughout the sculpting process, I continuously tested how he fit into his resting place. One thing that was going to set this figure apart was that I decided to add fringes running down the length of his pant leg. To do this, I rolled some putty into a snake and blended it into the surface of his leg. After that, I pressed the texture into the putty to give the effect that I wanted. I took very much the same approach to sculpting the coat as I did with my previous figure. I decided to have this figure wearing a fur-lined coat. I copied most of what he's wearing from an 1870s photograph I saw of frontiersman buffalo Bill Cody. The fur was made by rolling out some putty and then picking out the texture. The hands were sculpted in much the same way as I did when I made the previous figure. The only difference was that this time the hands were sculpted with pure milliput instead of my usual green stuff mix. I was much happier with how this turned out, and I'll probably stick with this method in the future. The next thing to do was to sculpt the sleeves and add some fur cuffs. I felt that shoulder-length hair was appropriate for this character. I also decided that it made more sense for him to be wearing a fur hat because it's cold outside. The hat was made in 2 stages, starting with the top and then adding a layer of fur around the sides. After this was done, it was time to move on to painting the figures. Before painting anything, I needed to winterize the base. I started by brushing on a snow mixture made from a blend of matte medium, woodland scenic snow, and water. I then sprinkled on some woodland scenic snow and washed out the edges with water. Then, I finished the scene off with a small blood trail. To prime the models, I brushed on a basic zenithal, then painted over that with flat acrylic to block out all the basic colors. I then started to paint the figures. Since this project was in part inspired by pulp artwork, I felt that oil paints were an appropriate choice. For CanCon reasons, I decided to give the standing figure a Hudson Bay blanket coat. These coats were made from trade blankets, which were traded with natives and fur trappers in exchange for pelts, and would have been worn by frontiersmen of all stripes. Unfortunately, the stripes only made it more obvious that I had accidentally sculpted one arm shorter than the other. I had no choice except to try and cover this up as best I could with a large bloodstain. For the final stages of painting, I had decided to mount both figures on the base. This was in part because I wanted to minimize my handling of the figures. In the case of the reclining figure, I also wanted to integrate the shadows I painted with the contours of the ground. The last thing to do was to use a bit of the snow mixture to level things out and ensure that both figures fit comfortably on the base. The song I had chosen for the music box mechanism was A Time for Us, composed by Nino Rota for Zeffirelli's 1968 movie Romeo and Juliet. It seemed like an appropriate choice, since I could imagine it having been used in the score for a spaghetti western film of the era. Thank you everyone for watching, and if you have any comments or questions about the build, then by all means, leave them in the comments.